Again, this is David Fenley. I am the chair of the Transportation Accessibility Advisory Committee for the Metropolitan Council. It is the first meeting of 2021. Welcome, everybody. I will go down my list of committee members and allow them to introduce themselves. For John, you are thank you, perfect. It's great whenever anybody starts talking to announce yourself so we know who is talking, especially for those of us on the phone who haven't memorized everybody's voices yet. So yeah, I will start. I have Claudia, go ahead.
Claudia Figley, MNCCD.
Eric. Come back to Eric when he finds the unmute button. Patsy. Patsy? You have to unmute.
There we go. Hello, name is Patsy Murphy. Did you want to say anything else, David?
Whatever you want. You want to say what part of the metro you're from? Otherwise, that's just fine.
I always forget what number I am. Allison may know.
Sounds good.
Patsy, you are C.
C. Okay, so I'm from C.
Diane?
I'm a Metro Mobility user. I do not use the buses, but I use the Metro Mobility. So it's one of my big things that I'm trying to work towards right now, making things better for all of us. Thank you.
Diane?
Hi, I'm Diane Graham-Raff. I represent the Metropolitan Area Agency on Aging.
And Daryl?
Daryl Paulson. I am the vice chair of TAC, as well as I represent F, I believe it is. Am I right on that, Allison?
You're which one?
F.
Daryl, you're F.
I've been a few of them over the course of time, so I forget which one I am at every now and then. But.
Jeff?
Jeff Daines, Precinct B.
John Clark?
Yes, John Clark, and what's my district? Inver Grove Heights.
Sounds good.
I remember it. Okay.
Am I missing somebody? Other committee members? Might be missing them.
Oh, David, are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Eric Hendrickson with the Minnesota Council on Disability.
Perfect. Thank you, Eric. Did I not call any committee members?
We've got two people trying to log in. I have to send them the information to get in. Christopher Bates and Richard Rowan.
Okay, and that will bring us to quorum.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think I will. Let's not wait on them getting the information because it might take a few minutes. I'd like to dive right in, and we can come back to the approval of agenda and minutes when we have quorum after Kyle and Nasser present on Network Next. From what I understand or know, Nasser is new to Metro Transit. I've actually worked with him in his previous role, so it's nice to still have you working on this type of stuff, Nasser. But I'll let Kyle take it away, and you can introduce yourself since you are new to this committee and to Metro Transit as you see fit. So take it away, Kyle and Nasser.
Great. Can folks all hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me and Nasser. My name is Kyle O'Donnell Burrows. I'm a senior planner in the BRT projects office at Metro Transit. And Nasser, I'll turn it over to you, and you can introduce yourself relatively. If we have you there.
Yes, I am here. Thank you, Kyle.
And so Nasser, just want to introduce yourself?
Oh yeah, I can do that. Hey, David, and everyone else, and thank you so much. It's good to see you again, David. And I know we've worked together in the past, and as you mentioned, and I am very new, and I think I'm a little bit over 4 weeks now at Metro Transit. And I am still enjoying what I'm doing, and it's very similar to what I have done in my previous role at the Secretary of State's office, mainly engaging public and informing about projects and making sure that people have their voices being heard and put their opinion in what we are doing and add the value of what we are doing into a public engagement and outreach.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
And so Nasser and I are just here to kind of provide an update on the arterial BRT component of Network Next, and provide a little bit of an update there, and then answer any questions that that this group might have. And I'll go ahead and get started on that, and then we've got about 15 minutes or so of content in these slides, and then Nasser and I will be happy to answer any questions you have.
And I will be giving a little bit updates of up to around the outreach, what we have done, the survey, and that kind of stuff. So I'll talk about that at the end.
Oh, great. Yep. Thanks, Nasser.
Yep.
With that, I just wanted to kind of remind this group that we were here last in September. And at that point, we had been sharing kind of an initial set of arterial BRT corridors that we were considering, as well as the results of a screening process that led us to narrow down that group to the 10 corridors that we were getting ready to evaluate in a little bit more detail. Today, what we'll be doing is sharing the results of that more in-depth evaluation, and kind of the results of that sorting of those corridors into groups based on their near-term, mid-term, and long-term priorities for implementation. And if we can go ahead to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. And so just a reminder that guiding our work throughout this entire process, both this portion of our evaluation and the identification and all of the steps we've been going through up to this point, we've been using really 4 principles to guide our work through Network Next. These principles are based on council policy, performance data, so how well are particular routes doing in terms of ridership or other metrics, and community input about communities' priorities with respect to what they want to see from our transit network and what's important to them. And those principles are advancing equity and reducing regional racial disparities, building on success to grow ridership on our network, designing a network that supports transit-oriented lifestyle, and then ensuring the long-term sustainable growth of our bus network to make sure that what we're putting out there today is sustainable and can remain in place over the long term. Next slide, please. And so to identify the BRT corridors through Network Next, we have been following a 4-step process. Our focus today is really on the results of step 3, which is evaluate there, where we are taking the narrower group of corridors and had applied a more in-depth evaluation process to them to help us identify the corridors for near-term, mid-term, and longer-term priorities for implementation. Our next step after having done that, and we'll be sharing the results of that today, will be to prioritize those near-term corridors to identify the next 3 lines for implementation specifically. So we'll be identifying the F, G, and H line from that top tier of corridors, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. But before getting into too much detail on the results of that step 3 evaluation, I do want to quickly recap steps 1 and 2, just to kind of make sure that we're all back on the same page. So we had initially identified a set of 19 corridors, which are shown here on this map, back earlier in 2020. And we identified these corridors based on those principles that I articulated earlier, and then specifically from the high frequency network of existing routes today, high ridership corridors. So there are some local routes that aren't currently on the high frequency network that are pretty high ridership, and so we included those as well. Corridors that were previously studied for arterial BRT, so that would include things like the North Snelling Lexington corridor, for example, which was considered for an A-line extension previously, as well as some other corridors. And then thinking about network balance. So we want to make sure that we are identifying corridors that are both pretty well distributed across the metro in terms of geographic balance between, East and West Metro and North and South, but also the role that those particular corridors play in our overall transit network. So we know, for example, that arterial BRT corridors are really successful when they're, kind of that core route into downtown, those really high ridership corridors that kind of go along a main road into downtown. We also want to make sure that we're considering routes that provide crosstown service, so not necessarily going directly into downtown, but still important parts of the network, and looking at suburb to suburb service as well. And so trying to consider a wide application of those types of services. Looking at these initial 19 corridors, we screened them down to a more manageable group of 10 corridors for more in-depth evaluation. And if you could go to the next slide, please. So that this map here shows those 10 corridors that we evaluated. And I'll just kind of list them here. They're on the slide as well, but it's the 63rd and Zane corridor, which is based on the Route 724. The Central Avenue corridor, which is based on the Route 10. The Como, Maryland corridor, which is based on the existing Route 3. The Grand Avenue corridor, which is based on the existing Route 63. Johnson-Lyndale corridor, which is based on the existing Route 4. Lowry corridor, which is based on the existing Route 32. The Nicollet corridor, which is based on the existing Route 18. The Randolph East 7th corridor, which is based on the Route 74. The Rice-Robert corridor, which is based on a combination of Route 62 and 68. And then the West Broadway Cedar corridor, which is based on a combination of, the Route 22 and Route 14. And to get to these corridors, I won't go into too much depth on the specific screening criteria used here, since we did cover that in our September meeting, and I want to preserve most of our agenda time for the evaluation results. But essentially, we looked at a high level, existing levels of transit service in that corridor, existing rider demographic and income characteristics, and the current and potential transit ridership in that particular corridor to get to these 10 from that initial 19. Next slide, please. So in our first round of engagement on those initial corridors, we also asked folks to let us know which of those BRT principles that I talked about earlier were most important to them for us to consider as we evaluated these corridors in a little bit more detail. And that input then would help us decide how to weight these overall principles as we're evaluating these corridors in more detail. And this graph here shows that the advancing equity and reducing regional disparities was really the clear priority from folks who participated in our survey. About 47% of respondents indicated that as their first priority. And then you can see that supporting a transit-oriented lifestyle came in second place, which was about half of the total. Sorry, about half as many people selected that one as they selected advancing equity. And then building on success to grow ridership and ensure the long-term sustainable bus networks were the third and fourth priority, respectively. Next slide, please. So we used that input as well as input policy guidance from our council members and from the transportation policy, the 2040 transportation policy plan, and Thrive MSP 2040 to land on the weights for each of these principles, and then to help us identify evaluation criteria that correspond to each of those principles. And you can see this table shows the principles themselves, along with the percentage of the overall score for each corridor that principle represented. So you can see advance equity and reduce regional disparities counted for 50% of the total corridor score. Build on success to grow ridership counted for 20% of the corridor score. Design a network that supports a transit-oriented lifestyle counted for 20% of the corridor score. And ensure the long-term sustainable growth of the bus network counted for 10% of the overall score. And then within that table are the specific evaluation criteria that we used for each principle. And I won't go into detail on each of these specifically, but certainly happy to ask questions or answer questions about those as we get towards the end. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a graph of the overall technical results of each corridor, and you can see them arranged in order from highest score to lowest score on this graph. And then each of the bar chart is color-coded for the score within each particular principle. Going from highest to lowest, I'll just sort of list out what the overall total technical score was. Como, Maryland corridor scored 87 out of 100 for the total score. Johnson-Lyndale scored 79 out of 100. West Broadway Cedar scored 77. Nicollet scored 74. Central scored 66. Randolph East 7th scored 57. Rice-Roberts scored 56. Grand scored 51. Lowry scored 47, and 63rd and Zane scored 42. So you can see there's a pretty good distribution of scores across each corridor from a technical standpoint. Some good groupings at the top, and then in the middle, and then towards the bottom. And so that was sort of the result of those overall evaluation results. And then next slide, please. But we know that the specific technical scores doesn't capture necessarily everything that's important about each of these corridors. In particular, we wanted to understand what other planning activities were happening in a particular corridor. So we did sort of a bit of a corridor readiness review. So for each of these corridors we identified, we looked throughout the region to understand if there were any other transit planning studies ongoing in that area, or anything else like that might affect that BRT corridor. And if there were, we decided to remove that corridor from consideration for near-term implementation and to hold it off to put it in kind of the midterm or longer-term implementation groupings. And that way we avoid doing duplicative planning work or conflicting transit infrastructure and investment, where we're saying one thing and another planning effort is saying another thing about the same corridor, and to sort of allow time for those questions to be worked out between the different agencies that are leading these various planning efforts. And so that review affected 4 corridors. The West Broadway Cedar corridor and the Lowry corridor were both affected by the Blue Line Extension project. So you recall that that project right now is considering other alignment options off of the freight rail corridor. And so in order to make sure to allow that process to play itself out, we wanted to avoid getting too far ahead of ourselves in that area, particularly on corridors that might be potential alternative alignments for that blue line corridor extension. And so we held off on those two corridors. The other corridors affected are the Nicollet BRT corridor, and that's affected by the Nicollet Central Modern Streetcar Project led by the city of Minneapolis. You'll recall that that project is identified from basically just over the river in Minneapolis along Central, but then down along Nicollet Mall and Nicollet Avenue to at least Lake Street. And so a big portion of that overlaps with our proposed Nicollet BRT corridor. And so we wanted to hold off for now until we answer more questions about that project. And then the Randolph East 7th corridor is affected by the Riverview Modern Streetcar Project, which is led by Ramsey County. And that project is primarily along the West 7th portion of that area. And so that impacts this corridor here as well. So that doesn't mean that we are saying we won't be doing these corridors, but rather that they make more sense in sort of that that midterm or longer term implementation, rather than starting right away with those, so we can have more time to answer questions about these. Next slide, please. And so this image here, which is a little bit complicated, so I'll just kind of talk through it real quickly, shows the sort of combines the technical evaluation of each corridor with that readiness result. And so it has the technical score for each corridor across the top, again, arranged from highest to lowest, and then whether or not the corridor is affected by another planning effort, so the corridors that we just talked through. And if they are, then we're saying that we're holding on those corridors we're not considering those corridors for Tier 1 implementation. And so we would consider them for Tier 2 or Tier 3, but not for Tier 1. And then so removing those corridors for consideration, we then just kind of went down the line from highest to lowest technical score to identify the corridors that are in Tier 1, and that's near-term implementation. And so the corridors identified in the near term for implementation are the Como, Maryland corridor, the Johnson-Lyndale corridor, the Central Avenue corridor, and then the Rice-Robert corridor. And so we've identified 4 corridors for consideration in the near term. And then looking at the corridors eligible, the remaining corridors, we just sort of then went back down the line from highest to lowest available technical scores. So Tier 2 then becomes West Broadway, Cedar, Nicollet corridor, and then Randolph East 7th corridor. And then Tier 3 becomes Grand, Lowry, and 63rd and Zane, and that's based on their technical score. And then the next slide, please, shows a map of these corridors as well as the key indicating which corridors are identified for near-term, midterm, and longer term, which I think is a little bit easier way to kind of understand this here. But you can see again, those near-term corridors for implementation are Central, Como, Maryland, Johnson-Lyndale, and Rice-Robert. And midterm is Nicollet, Randolph East 7th, and West Broadway Cedar. And then the longer term are 63rd and Zane, Grand Avenue, and Lowry Avenue. Next slide, please. And so then our next steps here, and this is sort of where we're currently in our engagement period, where we're asking for the public's input on those top tier corridors that we've identified in terms of which of their preferences would be to, which corridors we should implement first, second, and third. And we have a number of different means of getting the word out about this and really asking folks to give us feedback on their survey. And based in part on the results of that engagement, we will be identifying the F, G, and H lines from that group of 4 corridors. And those will be implemented beginning in likely in 2025, following the implementation of the E line, and then working from there. And so we'd be going to the Metropolitan Council in March to approve the recommended F, G, and H lines, and then going to TAB for action on the F line investment in April of 2021. And with that, I will turn it over to Nasser for a quick update on where we're at on our engagement so far, and other kind of other public engagement updates.
Thank you, Kyle. So as of now, we are at 3,000. We got 3,000 responses of a survey, which we sent out on December 14th. So we sent out the online survey to a number of areas. That includes Rider Club, Metro Transit app users, Met Council, Section 8 housing voucher holder. We also sent to the list of the cities that are within transit area. We also sent out to the community organizations as well. And the survey is open until January 20th. And we are planning to do also conduct in-person survey starting next week. So that is just, that would allow us to interact with people who might not get opportunity to do online survey, because sometimes it's really hard to engage people who might not have access to computer, and just being in a space where they are will give us opportunity to let them know that these activities are going on, and collect their opinion about this project as well. So we'll start that doing next week, and that we will be targeting some busy areas within St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Roseville, and Bloomington City. So we did also publish the survey in number of media and news outlets. That includes NPR, Pioneer Press, Star Tribune, Monk Times, Minnesota Spokesman, Recorder, Michelle. So another number of community media as well, including the Vida y Sabor magazine and Access Press as well. We also put some a poster in transit shelters as well, where people can scan and use that information to text survey. And we will continue engaging in this way until January 20th. So that is where we are with engagement, and we ask if you can help us promote this information, send a link to your group or community members. Would really appreciate, and happy to answer any question that you may have.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Chris. Thank you. Thank you, Kyle and Nasser. Chris, you have a question? Introduce yourself first, Chris, since we didn't get a chance before, but please proceed.
Yes, sir. I guess my question is from a political standpoint. I mean, yesterday, they announced the state's going to be in a $1.2 billion deficit by the end of the biennium, which means, and under federal and state law, we have to have a balanced budget. Are projects like this going to get pushed out further because of the finances at both the state and federal level? And if that happens, how does that change the demographic?
Chair, committee members, yep, that's a great question. And so, these are currently not funded, and the funding source is not identified for these. So if right now we're far enough out from these corridors where we're from the potential implementation of these corridors, where we're hopeful funding sources would be identified to continue the program as scheduled. So right now the F line, which would be the most recent, which would be the nearest to us corridor from this identified, would be scheduled to be implemented in 2025. And that project would have or we would hope would have some tab funding potentially allocated to it. That's one of the things we're going to tab this April to identify and potential funding from there. But looking at the corridors beyond that, you're right, there's not funding identified from them, which may change timelines, but we're sort of planning on the timelines we have right now with the hope that funding is identified for these projects.
Okay, thank you.
Do any other members have questions?
This is Jeff Danes, Precinct E. Just a couple of comments. I did have Doug Cook come with Peter Lindstrom to our Lauderdale City Council meeting. I've been pushing the various different cities in Precinct E to get it on their city website. I don't know if you've had any feedback from the cities themselves, because I think that's a good place to put it. And my question is, how much focus is there on the frequency of the routes? Because that's the thing I keep hearing from people about input. We have the Como, Maryland route, of course, on our boundary, the Route 3, and that question just keeps coming up over and over again.
Chairman, committee members, yep, that's great questions. Your point about the cities, yeah, the cities have been a very helpful resource for us in getting the word out. So I know some have been putting it on their website or certainly sharing it through their social posts or their other, if they have like neighborhood organizations or something like that through the city. And we've been sharing this information with city staff so that they can kind of help facilitate that as well. But definitely appreciate the folks in this committee to bringing it to their attention as well. And then the question about frequency. So the baseline, the basic starting point for this type of service is 10-minute, a bus coming every 10 minutes or throughout most of the day, 7 days a week. And so that's kind of our basic starting point and our basic model that we stick with. And so that's kind of the commitment that the plan that we have for these corridors is that they would be coming every 10 every 10 minutes for most of the day. And that wouldn't be, through both the peak periods and midday and then into the evenings and as they kind of wind down a little bit towards the beginning and the end of the day.
Thank you. I appreciate your answer on that.
This is Sam Jasmine. I have a question.
Go ahead, Sam.
I was curious about with your numbers for ridership. I think I heard you say you did. When you did those numbers, like when were they done? Like what was the timeline?
Chairman, committee members, yep. The existing ridership was in the fall of 2019, so before the pandemic. That was important to us to kind of get a sort of a pre-pandemic picture of what ridership looks like so that it helps us understand what in sort of normal circumstances ridership might look like.
And presumably you are planning on that in the winters, these would increase.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that part of the question.
In the wintertime, the numbers would probably increase.
Oh, I see. Typically, our highest ridership periods throughout in general are in the fall, and sort of going into the winters. But it sort of varies by route, but that's sort of the general trend. I think it typically has to do with when students in school are in session. So certainly winter is part of that. But we definitely anticipate ridership to increase when these corridors are implemented. But yeah, that seasonal fluctuation does happen in the fall and winter as well, and we try to consider that as we're looking at these figures.
Thank you.
Chair David, I have a question.
Go ahead, Daryl. Yes.
This is Daryl Paulson, Vice Chair. Kyle and to Nazra, I like your presentation. Your presentation is good. I like the 4 points that we're looking at, especially the racial equity piece. However, can you explain really quickly, or maybe we have to take it offline, how like Robert Street or like the Robert corridor, how they would score a 56, and what that 56 actually means to the project and so forth, and how we as committee members or we as riders can influence the process.
Chairman, committee members, yep, that's a great question. So specifically with respect to the Rice-Robert corridor, and really to more details for all these corridors, this is something.
If there's an easier corridor to explain like the number, then do that. The reason I chose that number or that corridor is because I was familiar with that corridor in the early 90s. So I thought I could understand a little bit, but if there's another corridor that's easier to explain how that number gets created, then you can do that as well.
Sure, sure. So the number, the technical score number that you're referring to is ultimately the result of the scores, the evaluation criteria scores for each of those four principles. And so specifically with respect to Robert Street, the Rice-Robert corridor, that one got a 56. It did sort of slightly worse than average with respect to the transit-oriented lifestyle principle and the advancing equity and reducing regional disparities principle. But the specific details of every evaluation criteria and the specific results are available in a technical memo we put together that has kind of score by score, which I think, David, if there's a way that it's available on our website, but if I can kind of share it with this community, with this committee, and then we could distribute it, that would be really helpful for folks to be able to kind of go through and review in detail if folks are interested in that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry, I think there was a second part of your question. I'm not recalling.
Yeah, how could, if scoring those criteria or actually evaluating those 10 dedicated lines, are those 10 dedicated lines, are they the same ones that we identified in the governor's budget 2 years ago when he took office, or have they slightly changed, or is that increased?
Mr. Chairman, committee members, they are slightly different. There is definitely some overlap, and certainly that was something that the governor's budget, I believe, not having that off the top of my head, but I believe looked at the corridors identified in the arterial transitway corridor study that was done in 2012, and this process is updating that, and so it's kind of taking some new information, and so certainly many of the corridors are the same through there because they still continue to be good corridors ready for investment, and then some things have changed based on how things have changed over the past 10 years, really. And I think you had also asked how you as committee members can kind of help influence this. I think, one really helpful thing would be to, if you haven't already, please take the survey that we have out. We're sort of asking specific input on how we would prioritize between these top tier corridors, and then obviously feedback today. Certainly we can take, and then distributing it to organizations that you're connected with or represent, or just your networks overall. I think would be, the more you can help us get the word out about this process and about this opportunity, I think would be really helpful to us.
Thank you.
David, this is Richard Rowan, AARP. I have a question.
Take it away.
Okay. Has there been any targeted outreach towards senior citizens? I know in Roseville we have high numbers of senior housing, just to get input from them and in addition to that, I'll send the survey to AARP and ask them to get it out to the membership.
Mr. Chair, committee members, I'll turn it over to Nasser actually if there's a specific outreach to the senior citizen community. I'm not aware of any specifically off the top of my head, though that is definitely something that we do as we're getting into the specific locations of specific stations and that type of thing. That's a big constituency that we're thinking about as we're sort of getting into the details of each of these specific corridors. But Nasser, maybe if you've got more information.
I don't have more information about that specifically right now, but I will be happy to share that information as we get into that details and get that information.
Great.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
This is David Fenley. Kyle and Nasser, just for clarification, because I think it's what I heard from you, Kyle, when you answered Daryl's question, which was a question that I had too, but so I'm glad you asked it, Daryl. Is it fair to say that communities in these areas, if you have overwhelming responses from some and not others, that can change when these projects get implemented?
Mr. Chair, committee members, yep, that's so that I would say that, so particularly among the 4 corridors identified in the near term, our next step is to identify which of those 4 should be essentially the implementation order of those 4. And so certainly public feedback and community priorities will be one of the inputs into that, that recommendation. We don't like to have it be a specific, it's not a specific vote necessarily, just because, sometimes, despite our best efforts, it's not always the case that these engagement efforts are sort of representative of the overall community. And sometimes a small organized group can really sway, the results of these types of things, but that's certainly something that we are considering. And so if there's one corridor that, stands out in popularity and just is really is a clear, a clear favorite, or similarly, if there's one that really does not have a lot of support, that's definitely important information for us in making this consideration.
Thank you, Kyle. This is David again. Just one follow-up, and then I'll get to, I think it sounds like somebody else has a question, John Clark. I'll come to you in just one second. So that leads me to commending Jeff Daines for doing, I think, exactly what the purpose of being on this committee is to really bring this to your local officials and decision makers and spread information like this throughout the community. So ideally, folks with disabilities could be one of those small organized groups that you speak of, Kyle. So I think that's fantastic. And I know others do it. I know Daryl's fantastic at doing that too. And just because I don't say your name doesn't mean that you don't do that. I just think it's good to point out when our committee is working the way that it is intended. John, do you have a comment or question?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Kyle, and members of the committee. I'm just thinking about the politics of equity and regional disparity, connecting that to the UMSTAD implementation, and thinking about this fancy term that I heard a couple of years ago, intersectionality, i.e., all these marginalized groups, persons of color, we have to hang together, or we hang separately And so I am interested in any thoughts that Kyle has or members of the committee, and this is probably outside the purview of a lengthy discussion here, but in terms of mobilizing communities to act in conference, especially given the budget upcoming budget problems that Chris was referring to. So maybe I'm just opening a discussion, but I realize that we only have till the 20th for the surveys.
This is David. Kyle Nasser, if you want to address that, by all means. I know that would probably take another hour to discuss. And did you all look at intersectionality in this at all when you were talking to folks?
Yeah.
Specifically, other minority groups and how they intersect with disability.
Mr. Chair, committee members. Yeah, so I think that is, in terms of what we are able to sort of look at from a demographic standpoint, we are sort of a little bit limited in our ability to kind of from a data perspective, like micro, be looking at kind of the different intersections between identities and how they might sort of show up in our data or not. But I certainly, I think the point you bring up stands in that we're trying to look at a broad group of historically disadvantaged communities, not just limited to any particular individual set of groups, but looking at a broad set of groups as we're considering sort of what equity means and how it applies to our evaluation criteria. And in terms of like the organizing around these issues, I think that's an important part of what we're trying to do here today, and what what we like to do in our outreach and engagement efforts. And I think what we would hope some community organizations are doing in contacting other stakeholders involved in this process as well.
This is David Bentley. We have a couple more minutes on the agenda. Did anybody else have any questions? Daryl?
Kyle, this is Daryl again. How often you take a look and you overlay these potential 10 projects for scoring? How often do you actually take that back to like the equity committee or outside stakeholders outside your own internal walls and say, hey, how does this fare against the actual test in our community? Not just test it within our own selves and our own organizations, but actually have somebody on the outside say, let's actually do a legitimate test on it and see if it actually fares the way that we say it does.
Chairman and committee members, yep. So we have had, let's see, 3 kind of general kind of engagement like phases throughout this project, starting in 2019, really about really looking at community priorities, and a big part of that push was kind of making some grants available for community organizations or individuals to host a community conversation kind of on their own terms, not facilitated by us unless our support was requested, but really about what is the best way that we can kind of get in touch with our community and kind of identify what are our priorities with respect to transit. And that information was a key piece of helping us identify those principles that we kind of have been using to guide our work. And then at various points throughout this project, essentially at every point, every kind of milestone throughout this project, we've been kind of going back out, checking in with, with this group, with the Equity Advisory Committee, with and also doing public engagement around that to help us check on that.
Thank you.
This is David Fenley. One last question. So it seems that near term means 5 years. Is that correct? And so what are the meanings of the mid and long term?
Mr. Chairman, that's a great question. So yes, we're near term for planners is maybe a little bit different than near term for sort of how you might normally use that word. And unfortunately for us, because of there's a lot of process that and it's engineering and environmental and all this kind of stuff that goes into these things. So for us, near term is basically between 2025 and 2030. And so that kind of 5-year window is sort of what we mean by the near-term implementation. That's not the only thing we're going to be doing between now and then, though. We also have, as you're all probably aware, the D line is in kind of the late stages of planning work, and then the B line and E line are sort of on deck here as well. And then following that, so that'll lead us into 2025. So we've got 3 corridors kind of coming up here that'll be opening between now and then that near term will be between 2025 and 2030, and then midterm and long term are sort of 5-year increments following that. So midterm would really be 2030 to 2035, and then long term is 2035 and sort of beyond. And that's all, again, pending funding, right? So TBD. It could be potentially sooner if we have just all this funding available, and then we can just kind of roll from there, but we'll see.
Because that's always been the case. Any last burning questions from committee members before we move on? Right. Well, thank you very much, Kyle and Nasser. We look forward to hearing back from you when you have more stuff for us. And as usual, if you feel like reaching out to the committee at all, you can come through me or Allison or Doug if you want some more information from us. Again, thank you very much for coming.
Sounds good. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate all of your time.
Yep. Thanks a lot.
So we
We have a quorum now.
We do. Thank you, Allison. I was just about to address that. I appreciate the reminder. So we had, from what I see, 3 committee members join us. I'll call out your names, and then if is anybody else that joined us, please chime in just so I have an idea of who is in the meeting that is a voting member. So Chris Bates joined us. Are you still here, Chris?
Yep, I am.
And Richard Rowan.
Yeah, I'm still here.
And Sam Jasmine.
I'm here.
Did I miss anybody? All right. So I will take that as a no. Just a reminder to folks, we're actually doing a really good job so far in muting and not having a lot of background noise, but just a mid-meeting reminder to mute if you're not talking, and if you're on the phone, *6 mutes you. Okay, so we will move on to approving of the agenda, and then we will go on to the minutes since we have quorum now. I would entertain a motion to approve the agenda or change it.
Jeff Danes. Oh, second, Jeff Danes.
So that was Chris and then Jeff?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to go down the list here. Roll call. When you hear your name, say yes, no, abstain. Claudia?
Yes.
Eric?
Yes.
Patsy? You can give a thumbs up if you want.
Yes.
Okay. Diane?
Yes.
Daryl?
Aye.
Jeff,
Yes.
John,
Yes.
Chris,
Yes.
Richard,
Yes.
Sam,
Yes.
and I say yes as well. That is unanimous. Okay, moving on to the minutes. Did anybody have any changes or thoughts on the minutes? If not, I would entertain a motion. Approve.
Second.
Jeff Danes here, motion to approve.
Perfect. Looks like we got the same two, Chris and Jeff. I will go down the list, same order, because it's how I wrote you all down on a piece of paper. Claudia,
Yes.
Eric,
Yes.
Patsy, Diane. Oh, Patsy gave a hands up, Allison, so that was a yes. Diane,
Yes.
Daryl,
Aye.
thank you. Jeff,
Yes.
John,
Yes.
Chris,
Yes.
Richard,
Yes.
Sam,
Yes.
and then David is yes as well. So another unanimous meeting minute approval. Let's move on to Jake for the statewide pedestrian system plan. You can take it away, Jake.
Thank you, Chair Friendly, and thank you to the committee members all for having me here today. Okay, great. Thanks for sharing my slides, Jason. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jake Reuter. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a young-ish white guy with a hilariously still intact quarantine red mustache. I'm happy to be here with all of you today to share a little bit about MnDOT's statewide pedestrian system plan. This is a project that we've been working on for about 2 years at MnDOT, and in my role as a pedestrian and bicycle planner, it's been a really central part of the work that I've been doing as of late. As we get into the presentation, I want to start by sharing that MnDOT uses the National Center on Health, Physical Activity, and Disabilities definition of walking, which through their How I Walk campaign is an inclusive physical activity term individualized to the ways that people walk through the world around them. So that can be using mobility devices, wheelchairs, walkers, canes. MnDOT uses the term walking to describe all the ways that people move themselves through the world, and that's reflected in the slides to follow. Can we go to the next slide, please? So our agenda for the time that we have together today, and hopefully we can have some discussion as well, is I'll walk you through what our statewide pedestrian system plan is. I'll share a little bit about what we heard from our stakeholders along the way. We can talk about what the draft statewide pedestrian system plan addresses and what's included. And then finally, we'll talk about how you can give your input on the plan. The plan is currently up for public comment, and the public comment period is open until January 11th. So we can talk about the public comment period and the ways that folks can get involved. Next slide, please. So we'll start with a quick overview of the statewide pedestrian system plan. There's an image on this slide of a demonstration project that was installed in Alexandria, Minnesota as part of our engagement work for this project. That demonstration project used some plastic tube delineators to make a median crossing island more visible for people driving on the roadway and to provide more of a protected space for people crossing the street to cross a busy section of MnDOT highway that's 4 lanes, 2 in each direction, and is a common crossing place for people going from the neighborhood to the south to the lake up north. Next slide, please. So there are 5 key goals that are built into our statewide pedestrian system plan. First is to tell the story of why pedestrian networks are an essential part of the transportation system. Second is to match our investment planning and project development to public expectations. Third is to prioritize investments using a tool that relies on equity, safety, infrastructure, health, and land use contexts. Fourth is to develop policy, guidance, and training for MnDOT staff. And fifth is to expand the definition of PED planning beyond meeting ADA compliance requirements. We go to the next slide, please. So about the planning process itself, we kicked this project off in February of 2019, which is starting, well, nearly 2 years ago. It's starting to feel like we've been working on this for quite some time. We did our initial public engagement wave in the summer of 2019. Then we did our internal engagement with MnDOT district staff during the winter of 2019 and 2020. We then took all of the things we learned through engagement and put together some process recommendations to share with our Project Advisory Committee, or PAC, in the spring of 2020. And that meeting, I remember distinctly having conversations with folks about, wow, do we think that we'll be here at the office next week? What's going on with the pandemic? How is this going to shape the way that we finish this plan? And sure enough, I think within a week, we had all been informed to work from home and work remotely. That had big impacts on our phase 2 engagement, which was in summer of 2020. That engagement push went 100% virtual without any in-person sort of canvassing or conversations. We then did internal review of the draft plan over the course of fall 2020, and the plan was released for public comment on December 10th, 2020. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about the engagement results that we received from community and what we heard from our stakeholders. There's an image on the slide of an event that we did in Mankato, where we had a listening session with a group of folks and talked over food about what people thought we could do to improve walking in the state. And that's pretty representative of what we did in phase 1. Unfortunately, we'd hoped to do that again in phase 2, but with the pandemic, we used mostly virtual means. Next slide, please. So there are a couple big theme areas that we wanted to talk with people in Minnesota about regarding walking along and across MnDOT roadways. The first was really honing in on crossing improvements and what we could do to help people feel safer crossing our roadways. In phase 1 of our engagement, we asked more plain language, higher level things. So we'd ask the question, what would help you feel safer crossing the street? And some of the potential responses would be things like, I'd like cars to stop for me. I'd like to feel more visible. I'd like a shorter crossing distance, that kind of stuff. And we went back out in phase 2 with some more technical sort of options of how we could achieve the results that people told us they were interested in. And the most popular crossing improvements that we heard from folks were having more time to cross the street, constructing curb extensions, and pedestrian refuge islands. Curb extensions are sort of where the curb bumps out and shortens the crossing distance at an intersection. And a pedestrian refuge island is where there's a safe waiting place in the middle of the roadway as you make the crossing. What we heard from folks were the least helpful in terms of crossing are those in-road stop for pedestrian signs that are sort of a paddle that go in the middle of the roadway. We know that they get drivers' attention, but they don't necessarily provide a sense of safety or any sort of improvement for people who are crossing the roadway. Next slide, please. We also asked folks in phase 2 what pedestrian or walking safety means to them. And the number one response that we received from folks was safety at crossings and intersections, which I think is a trend that we heard reliably throughout and maybe makes sense given that we're asking people about the MnDOT system, which is not most of the places that people maybe are walking along the roadway, but are definitely places where people cross the roadway and may encounter difficulties. The second most popular response we heard was to prioritize pedestrians over vehicles or provide equal access. Third was well-maintained sidewalks and trails for all users. Fourth was not to have to worry about driver behavior. And then sort of in a run of pretty similarly voted on responses, we had proactive and responsible pedestrians, physical barriers between pedestrians and vehicles, adequate lighting and shade, and a complete sidewalk network without gaps. There were some themes that came up when we asked this question that we thought were maybe pandemic related. So people asked about wider sidewalks, perhaps wondering if there's a way that we can help with social distancing and maintaining that 6 feet of space between folks. Adequate lighting, which we think maybe is related to people sort of expanding the times when they are outside and trying to stretch the day, so to speak, in an effort to avoid crowds. And then just some general perceptions of safety that I think folks were thinking more about with the pandemic in its relatively early phases. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about the engagement that we did with the disability community in Minnesota. So in phase 1, when we were able to do in-person events, we held events in partnership with Smiles, which is an organization where we had facilitated conversations in Mankato and Fairmont, Minnesota, both sort of southern part of the state, and also at the Courage Kenny Institute, just west of Minneapolis. When we looked at the demographic breakdown of our surveys, people with disabilities made up 17% of our survey responses compared to 11% of the statewide population. And then phase 2, we did not know how things would go when we went completely virtual. We could look at our phase 1 results, and we knew from phase 1 that we had better success connecting with people with disabilities, people of color, and people of low wealth in person. And so we were concerned that we may not make those same connections in phase 2. That was certainly true when we were in terms of talking about connecting with people of color and people of low wealth. We had a harder time connecting with folks via the virtual engagement tools that we had at our disposal. But we were able to connect with folks in the disability community still. People with disabilities made up 12% of our survey responses in phase 2, which is still higher than the 11% of the statewide population. This was all voluntarily reported demographic information that was at the end of the survey, so we're only able to share data on what people were willing to share with us. Next slide, please. So earlier there was discussion of a demonstration project that we put in Alexandria, Minnesota, and that is an example of 7 different demonstration projects that we installed around the state as a way to sort of show and provide a space for people to move through that is representative of the kinds of improvements that we might be recommending through this plan. So our phase 2 engagement asked the question of how supportive people were of these demonstration projects, 1 being not supportive, 5 being very supportive. Overall, our response was a 3.9. So I would say pretty supportive, maybe not like wholeheartedly all in on doing these. And the responses ranged from that sort of 3.7 range to 4.2. We didn't have a really noticeable geographic trend in this regarding the state. So districts 1, 2, and 3 are our northernmost districts. Those were all around 4. Districts 4, 7, and 8 are the westernmost part of the state. We saw slightly lower interest in doing these projects on the western part of Minnesota. And then District 6 and Metro are at sort of the east, central, and southeast part of the state. And in both of those community, or both of those MnDOT districts, we had 4.2 and 3.9. So we think that there is support for continuing to try these. What we heard from communities where we put these in is that they typically appreciate the effort, but there are tweaks that they'd like to see made. And I think that that's an opportunity for us. These demonstration projects are a lot cheaper than coming out and doing the full road construction project. And they're an opportunity for us to learn how we can do the final project a lot better in partnership with the community. Next slide, please. So there's an infographic that was produced as part of this this project, and I'll read through the high points of it for folks on the call. So 2,700, we had slightly over 2,700 surveys from across the state completed as part of our engagement work, and nearly 3 out of 4 respondents who we connected with completely support improvements for walking. The #1 choice for policies that improve walking was improving winter maintenance. I think that is not something that we were surprised to hear, and we'll talk a little bit more about what we're thinking about on the winter maintenance front later on. 62% of people want us to improve accessibility on, add, or widen paths and sidewalks. 1 out of 4 votes to improve crossings were for designs that would encourage people to stop for pedestrians. 85% of respondents highly support the installation of a demonstration project. And the top design choices for crossings, again, just to repeat them, are more time to cross, curb extensions, and pedestrian refuge islands. In total, we did 42 in-person engagement events before the pandemic and installed 7 demonstration projects around the state. Generally speaking, I think we're pretty pleased with the engagement work that we did, and we learned a lot from folks who completed the survey, and it really did help to guide our work as we put together the draft plan. Next slide, please. So there's another just clip of the demonstration project here. This one was installed on St. Paul's west side. It involves curb bump outs and was featured in a Fox or a Channel 5 ABC news clip about the pedestrian plan. So I want to talk a little bit about what the PED plan itself addresses. You can go to the next slide. So there are these process recommendations that I referenced before, and these are sort of the big buckets of the internal MnDOT stuff that we can work through to make walking better along and across our system. And those include the cost participation policy, which is how MnDOT shares costs with local partners, local government. And the plan really looks at how MnDOT can do a better job of supporting the investment in infrastructure for walking. We talk about scoping and need identification, which is how we answer the question of how do we know where we should build improvements on the system? And then maintenance. So how do we keep the system functional year round? Here we're talking a lot of times MnDOT, when we construct something, we sign a maintenance agreement with a local unit of government to take on the responsibilities of maintaining the sidewalk facility in the long term. So what we're looking at is making sure that we have those partners who will be doing the maintenance involved when we design facilities, so that we make sure that we're hearing what kinds of equipment they use, how we can best set up the design in a way that allows for appropriate snow storage, all those kinds of things. And one exciting thing that I can share is that we are about to kick off a research project looking at how we could potentially design our bump outs and median islands and other pedestrian safety measures in a way that will make them easier to maintain in the winter by changing maybe the curb profiles, maybe looking at the angles of approach and things like that to hopefully make it a little bit easier with the equipment we have now to maintain these things in the winter. Next slide, please. Next thing that we looked at, and this is a big part of a lot of MnDOT planning efforts, is into investment planning and a general cost approach. So unfortunately in Minnesota, we don't have statewide data available for land use context and the anticipated impacts of climate change. So what we did in this work was relied on sampling roadways and intersections to develop assumptions that guide the statewide cost estimate. So the 3 steps we took to do that were to identify the metro and rural context of intersections and roadways in our highest priority areas where we expect there to be the top 5% of need for walking. We then sampled intersections and roadways to develop our assumptions about the prevalence of land uses and roadway conditions. And then third, applied the assumptions that we had made across all high priority areas to develop cost estimates. And if we go to the next slide, I can share what those cost estimates are. So in terms of linear pedestrian facilities or the types of sidewalks and paths, shared use paths that we would have along a roadway, to meet that top 5% of need in the state, we expect it would cost between 118 and 237 million. And the estimate assumes that that includes 79 miles of new shoulders, which is a really important safety improvement we can make in rural areas, 114 miles of sidewalks, 111 miles of side paths, and 73 miles of sidewalk and side path in the same corridor. We also looked at intersections, and the range here is a little bit wider. So to meet that top 5% of need, we're looking at 76 million to 351 million. And it includes basic improvements to be installed at a total of 267 2-lane intersections, 456 multi-lane intersections, and 170 ramps and roundabouts. There are also enhanced crossing treatments that we can add on to that, and that would be applied at 160 crossings. Next slide, please. On top of the actual physical infrastructure, we wanted to look at some of the impacts that affect people who are walking along and across our system. And we know that when it comes to mitigating climate change, people who are walking do not have the luxury of a climate-controlled vehicle that encases them. They don't have the luxury of being protected from wind, rain, cold, so on and so forth. So we wanted to ask ourselves what we could do as a way to help make the walking environment a little bit more resilient in the face of climate change. So this includes creating a complete tree canopy and managing stormwater runoff when constructing pedestrian improvements. We anticipate for that same top 5% of need that would cost between $130 million and $360 million, and it would include 455 miles of MnDOT roadways in total. The types of improvements that we might be looking to make would include shade trees, tree vault systems for sucking up rainwater, planted center medians, bioswales, which are rain gardens essentially, and flow-through planters. All of these things help to mitigate stormwater, so flash flooding. They help to reduce urban heat island and can protect shelter or provide shelter from the sun, and other elements. Next slide, please. So the plan also includes some guidance tables that help to outline what we would expect as a starting point for conversations about pedestrian infrastructure. So if we are doing a reconstruction project in a suburban residential area, I'll walk across the table and say that we would expect we would investigate new or enhanced sidewalk or side path on both sides of the street. We'd look at road diets or travel lane or parking lane narrowing as part of the project, installing curb extensions or tightening turning radii, which makes it difficult for vehicles to take turns at fast speeds. We would look into adding benches and planting shade trees. Next slide, please. So that's a really high-level overview of what's a pretty long plan document, and I want to talk a little bit about the public comment period and how folks can give input on the plan. There's an image here of a sidewalk cling that we used as part of our virtual engagement push, which we stuck down on sidewalks and on pedestrian bridges around the state. That included a quick read code for folks with smartphones to access, along with a URL to take our survey, which is kind of fun. They're fun to install, they come up really easy, and they're non-slip, so we think they're an exciting tool to use for the future. Next slide, please. So we'd love to hear what people think about the plan and our work so far. The draft plan is available for public comment through, I believe it's 4:30 on January 11th, which is next Monday. The project website has two mechanisms for folks to comment. The first is an online interactive comment system, which allows users to drag sort of rectangles around the area where they'd like to leave a comment and then type things in. You can also like or upvote other people's comments who you agree with, which makes it kind of a nice interactive sort of tool. The other option that we have available is a downloadable accessible PDF that you can leave comments in as well and return to me, and we'll get those fed into the comment response document. All of the information for that can be found on our project website, which is available at www.minnesotawalks.org/participate. Next slide, please. So that concludes the slides that I have to share with all of you today. I'm happy to certainly take questions now, and also will share my email address, which is jacob, jacob.rueter, RUETER, @state.mn.us. And we can chat via email, and yeah, I appreciate you all taking the time today and for having me here to share the work that we've been doing.
This is David. Thank you very much, Jake, and thank you for your attention to accessibility, especially with your audio description of yourself. I think that's something maybe we can start to do here. I have a couple questions. I'm sure that committee members do too. This is something that's very important to all of us. I realize, I think we all realize this is statewide, but this is the committee for the Metro for folks with disabilities. So it's a fantastic opportunity for MnDOT to get public input from folks with disabilities in the Metro, all in one place. I will open it up to committee members first and then come back to my questions. Surely you all will probably ask the same questions in a more articulate way. So is there anybody that wants to go first?
Mr. Chair, I do have a question. This is Eric Henderson.
Go ahead, Eric.
I am curious. Thank you for the presentation, Jake. I'm curious on how this plan addresses already deficient pedestrian access routes and pedestrian ramps. I can kind of hear Heidi, if she was here, I think she is, kind of saying, why are we investing? We're thinking about, MnDOT thinking about investing in improving maybe already compliant pedestrian access routes and ramps when we have so many that are not in compliance. I'm wondering if this plan takes into account those deficient areas already within the system.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. That's a great question. For better or for worse, I mean, I think there are definitely good things about this and things that make it a little bit confusing. MnDOT is also updating its ADA transition plan at the very same time as this plan is being developed. So the ADA transition plan is really where we detail out our approach to rectifying the issues that we have in terms of ramps or sidewalks and ADA compliance issues. the PED plan looks to sort of expand beyond the legal definition of accessibility and start to think about access to community locations, opportunities, friends, family, shopping, the library, so on and so forth. And so one of the things that I think is often true is that we make our improvements, whether they are pedestrian network improvements or ADA compliance improvements, in a way that follows our programmed projects to basically achieve some cost efficiencies. And because so much of our system was out of compliance, that we could do all the work just by following the roadway projects that we had already. I think as we rectify more and more of the issues on the system, we'll probably have to see us going and doing specific ADA improvement projects to meet some of the things that aren't part of an existing MnDOT construction project. That ADA transition plan is going to have a lot more details about how and when and sort of the nuts and bolts of how we make that happen than the statewide pedestrian system plan does.
This is David. That's a great question, Eric. And I can say, because I'm participating in the transition plan process with MnDOT, and hopefully we'll get them here in the near future, but MnDOT's taking a rather aggressive approach to eliminating barriers over the next 10, I think it's under 10 years in terms of statewide. Aggressive being good. But yeah, there is overlap, Jake, if I understand correctly, like you were stating, there is overlap. And this project is more focused on usability and going above and beyond ADA. And the ADA plan's just intention is to address all barriers in the state of Minnesota for MnDOT properties and projects. Is that correct?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, that is correct. Yep.
Daryl, take it away.
I have a couple questions, and then you'll have to probably respond to me offline. I have some serious questions relating to the pedestrian right-of-way and the pedestrian work that you're doing in regards to this, because we talk about making, in the very beginning of your presentation, you talked about having relationships with municipalities and different city governments and developing relationships relating to snow removal or maybe trash removal, or even the fact that maybe it's not a shelter that we maintain. Maybe it's not one of our 179 shelters that we maintain, but we have a cooperative agreement with a city. There's many cities and suburbs particularly that those agreements are not kept up, and they are actually not followed because they actually fall in line with the Public Works Department within the local government, which relates to the 20-hour snowfall before they have to actually maintain and clean something up. So if that is truly the case, and you're being aggressive in developing those relationships, then why aren't we addressing adequate lighting to those stations and from those stations? Because once we address adequate lighting and adequate heating, then the crime element and the undesirable elements that we look at, they typically go away once we address some comfort issues. So that, I know I didn't specify my comments to particular issues relating to your plan, but I would say that I've been involved in the 2020 plan, and then I was involved in the 2030 plan, and then I got a little involved in the 2040 Thrive plan. And in each one of those plans, we don't fully address the equity piece that we spoke about so eloquently earlier in an earlier presentation. We don't address lighting or safety or security that we talk about in the wake of a pandemic. I mean, when do we start to talk about those issues and develop plans that actually address those concerns?
Chair Fenley and Vice Chair Paulson, if I could, I'd like to respond to the municipal agreement part of the question that you shared, Vice Chair. One of the action items in our plan is to figure out a way for us to actually staff up our enforcement of some of those municipal agreements. So one of the things that we learned as we talked with our maintenance folks is that we haven't really put a lot of effort into checking up to make sure that those maintenance agreements are being followed. And so we, as MnDOT, need to develop a process for how we check up, first create maintenance agreements that people can follow through on, and then second, check up to make sure that that work is actually getting done. And I think, Vice Chair, you raised an important point. This isn't just like winter stuff. It can be trash removal. It can be vegetation clearance. There are a lot. It could be replacing a light bulb if a light bulb's burnt out. So there are a lot of aspects of it that I think we need to pay closer attention to going forward.
Thank you.
John, go for it.
I was heartened to see references to global warming in your presentation. My question is, how forward thinking is MnDOT and the agencies and the legislature powers to be in terms of taking that a broader ecological approach. I mean, we have a huge infrastructure problem with, for instance, handling sewage. Billions and billions have been spent to deal with the wastewater in Chicago and the Chicago River, and another metropolitan community coming at it from a more recent ecological point of view is using that perspective. And if we simply try to deal with the issues of accessibility and equity on a piecemeal basis without looking at the entire ecological position, since we are marginalized groups anywhere, we're going to be fighting a losing battle. To what extent do people in the legislature, in the bureaucracy, understand the importance of the strategic allocation of funds in a future-oriented sense?
Thanks, Chair Fenley and Committee Member Clark. I think that's a really, first I appreciate the kind words about us having included some thought into the climate mitigation.
Yes.
What I can share is that this pedestrian plan and the way that planning at MnDOT works is really limited in its scope to thinking about the system for people walking. MnDOT has a broader policy plan that, having worked at the council for a short period of time, I think equates sort of similarly to the Thrive policy plan. It's called our statewide multimodal transportation plan, and it's due for an update. The update process is actually just starting next month. So that plan is where we look at...
Say that again.
It's our statewide multimodal transportation plan.
Okay.
And that plan is where we look at the connections between transportation and environment, economy, equity. It really goes into some of those bigger picture topics. So I would say that MnDOT has just created an Office of Sustainability and Public Health, where we have folks who are working specifically on better understanding the impacts of climate change on not just the system as it's built, but also the users of the system. And we're seeing a lot of momentum towards how we are responding to the threat of climate change on a systemic level. And hopefully that will be part of what comes out of that statewide multimodal transportation plan. They'd probably be a great group to have come talk with this group once they get rolling.
Wow. Thank you for your awareness, Jake.
Absolutely.
Sam Jasmine, I have a question.
Go ahead, Sam.
Since you're really concentrating on this great safety walking pedestrian stuff, are we also including audible traffic signals, or is there more of a push to do those, or is it still up to individuals or certain cities to be initiating placement?
Thanks, Chair Finley and committee members. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I know that we have not covered audible traffic signals as part of the statewide pedestrian system plan, but it may be a topic that's covered in our ADA transition plan. For the MnDOT roadway system, I'm not sure how it works for locally owned roadways.
Mr. Chair,
Proceed. Yep.
this is Claudia. Just a couple questions. I do have issues with the crosswalks and stuff. And when you're talking about crosswalks, are you going to have it so that it's going to be more visible to the drivers, the motorists, to know where the crosswalks are? And also the crosswalks or the ramps, the curb cuts become more wider and easier to use. And like Sam was saying, more of an audible push button for the folks who need that. And I do appreciate the survey that you've been doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair Finley and committee members. We, I think, at MnDOT are in an interesting time because in addition to the ADA transition plan and in addition to a statewide pedestrian system plan, we are also updating our road design manual. And so part of doing that work is where we would include technical recommendations for the types of crosswalk markings that we install. I believe the standard practice for MnDOT is to use the sort of, they're called a bunch of different names, but it's, I believe, a zebra style crosswalk. It's got the thicker white blocks that are longer. And we know from research that those longer blocks are easier for people driving to see compared to sort of the two stripes on the outside that are sometimes used as well. We do have a number of safety countermeasures, types of things, whether it's rapid rectangular flashing beacons or signage or other things that we can install that help to improve visibility at places where folks should be expecting people to cross the roadway that we also can rely on. And some of the recommendations for those are included in this plan. But the decisions really on where to install them come down to a project by project basis is what I would say. So we're providing a starting point, but what gets implemented is ultimately how this plan gets carried through our projects.
So would you have folks being there to help out with the design of lighting, pedestrian crossing, things that need to be done for accessibility for everybody?
Thanks, Mr. Chair and committee members. We have a few different things that happen when we are scoping projects or coming up with what will be included. Some projects undergo what we call a pedestrian and bicycle field walk, where we take the project manager and designers out to walk the project corridor and or bike the project corridor as well, so that they have the experience of using either a bike in a facility or walking along a facility. We also typically have ADA field walks as well, where we have our ADA technical team go out with project managers and identify issues and how we can make fixes. So there are a couple opportunities for project staff to connect with folks who can make recommendations on how to best serve communities. Yep.
Thank you.
Do other committee
I've
members?
yeah, this is Eric again. I've got a quick question. Does this
Go for it.
plan, does this plan kind of take the more idealistic, best, how can I put this? The best plan for an intersection or pedestrian access route and not think about cost, and then the project tries to almost make it work with the budget that they have? I mean, there's certain things I think when you're looking to, I saw one of the slides was looked at 100 and some miles of sidewalk. Sidewalk can be difficult to install if you don't have the right of way. You got to go through right of way acquisitions. There's a lot of, I think, funding. Funding can usually be a hamper when you're looking to do a lot of these improvements. So does the plan look at it kind of funding aside and saying, well, this is what should be done at this intersection to make it the best that we can with, you know, the constraints of the site? Or I guess how does the plan address that? Or how does it work with project?
Yep. Thank you, Chair Fenley and committee members. This plan is what we would consider a fiscally unconstrained plan. So it looks at what would it cost for us to do the best possible thing in the locations where we've identified. The reason that we do that is it gives us a better understanding when the time comes for us to divide how we invest our roadway funding. It gives us the best understanding of what we expect costs to meet people's needs while walking along the system to be. In the past, when this is the first time we've done a statewide pedestrian system plan. When we haven't had it, it's much more difficult for us to quantify what those costs would be on future projects. And then we really run into a bind when we're short of the resources we need to make the improvements. So yes, this is sort of the best case scenario. Yes, there are constraints when projects come through, but I do believe that having this up front puts us in a better position to make the case for those improvements to be included as part of projects.
Do other committee members have comments? If you're not distracted by other things happening in the world right now.
Yeah, at this time, I know Guthrie has been waiting too. He's been very patiently. So I would love to hear your comment. And maybe then
Daryl, I think that's a fantastic idea. I'm going to make 2 quick points, 1 question and 1 point, and then I will turn it over to Guthrie. I do appreciate the reminder, Daryl. Is there anything regarding roundabouts in this plan? I know that they're popping up in Greater Minnesota and also a lot in the suburbs here, and they're not very pedestrian friendly, I think, to put it nicely, because people are driving faster and they're not signalized. So I think, or I know folks with disabilities are not a big fan of these. They're great for traffic flow, but not great for pedestrian.
Thanks, Chair Fenley. We don't have, I believe, any specific mention of roundabouts in the pedestrian plan. One of the things that we do talk about, and I want to share since you brought up vehicle speeds in particular, is in the plan, we articulate that slower speeds save lives, that we know that when we can reduce vehicle speeds, and that has positive impacts for anybody who's involved in a crash. It reduces the amount of energy transferred. It makes the outcomes a lot better for people, basically everyone. And so the other thing that we have in the plan is focusing on doing those speed reduction and other safety improvements through design and not simply through enforcement or putting up signage and things like that. So we know that people who are driving vehicles do so based on the environment that they're in. So this, I think, could apply to a roundabout. If we have a really large roundabout with multiple lanes and it's easy to breeze through it quite quickly, that's sort of the behavior that we should expect to have happen if we've designed it that way. So while we don't directly call out roundabouts, I think some of the principles probably apply from our other statements about design.
This is David Fenley, and I'm pretty confident that most of the disability community would be on board with that being a comment in this plan. And just a fun fact about the 11% statistic of Minnesotans, the fact that 17% of the respondents in what was it, phase one, 17% were folks with disabilities. That's actually a lot closer to the national average number, which is I think 24% of the population has what qualifies as a disability under the ADA. The 11% doesn't take into account a few populations in Minnesota, one of which being people who are involved in institutions. So just a fun fact for you and your people. I'm sure you already knew that. The state demographer knows it too, but I'll leave it at that. We are running up on time here. I'm going to let Guthrie, because I know that you have some good input here. Please, Guthrie, take it away.
Well, thank you, Chair and committee members, and thanks, Jake, for the presentation. So I'm Guthrie Byard, the Council's ADA and Title VI Administrator, he, him pronouns, white male with a dark COVID beard. So I submitted comments online already, but I just wanted to make sure that I brought a few of them forward, understanding that there's not a lot of time here, and Jake, I'm happy to follow up with you offline and connect with your ADA unit at MnDOT. But I do want to make sure that, kind of related to Eric's initial comments, that I'm really focused on curb cuts too, and the fact that the report does call out that 61% of statewide curb cuts are inaccessible, and there's folks know there's different types of curb cuts. We're starting to see that they are being replaced. I live near a lot of schools, and a lot of schools are having them replaced with like that blended transition, and I know that there can be some issues with that, pedestrian safety issues with that, and want to know a bit more about how exactly the funds that are being dedicated for accessible pedestrian improvements are going to go towards addressing curb cuts. So the report says that by 2037, about $354 million or so is needed in order to address these ADA improvements. I'm assuming that this is related to the ADA transition plan and some other work that MnDOT has done, and that in fact MnDOT has dedicated well over that. I believe the report said $530 million or so. So can you talk just a little bit more about the focus on curb cut replacement, and in particular, what kind of input will be asked for from community members from TAC to address these curb cut issues, and what kind of partnerships do you see with Metro Transit more broadly?
Thanks, Chair Fenley, and thank you, Guthrie, for your questions. So first off, how do the funds for ADA improvement sort of come through to actually fix curb ramps and things? Those funds are assigned through a MnDOT process and plan that's called our Minnesota State Highway Investment Plan. That will start pretty quickly on the heels of our statewide multimodal transportation plan, and that's how we divide up the roadway investment funds that MnDOT has. So there are, at least in the past version of the plan, there's a number of different categories, of which accessible pedestrian infrastructure was one, and that's where the funding totals that you referenced are determined for our next 20 years of projects. I think some of the more specific questions about how we do engagement and how we decide which ramps are sort of closest up in the queue and which sidewalks are going to be replaced, those are things that would definitely be better answered by the folks working on the ADA transition plan than me. And I'm happy to connect you and the committee with folks who are working on that project, and I'm sure they'd be happy to come speak to that work.
Thanks for that. And related to that too, I think that with this plan, as you had mentioned, really the emphasis with this pedestrian plan is that it expands beyond accessibility or ADA compliance. I think where this plan could benefit from is with all the talk about ADA and accessibility, there really needs to be some guideposts or some guidelines that, the plan and the individuals behind the plan are working towards to address expanded accessibility. So if it's universal design principles that are being employed and looked at and asked for community input on, or with that new Office of Sustainability and Public Health, if there's more of a public health lens that's being applied to accessibility more broadly, those kinds of things, it would be good to kind of have that spelled out. And if in a large plan like this, it's not possible to have that maybe in the updated ADA transition plan, there's reference to that, or with some sort of working group or something like that, I think would be really beneficial in this particular case.
Great. Thank you.
Just a few other things. So kind of related to Daryl's comment, I am really interested in greater collaboration with Metro Transit and possible opportunities for TAC and for myself when it comes to things like the maintenance agreement conversations. Snow removal is a huge issue, and when you there's a finite amount of space, and so when you're talking about public right-of-way and snow removal, and certainly in very dense urban environments, there's only so many spots where that snow can pile up, and then you've got Metro Transit public facilities that remove it, and then the city that comes through and pushes it back to make some of those stops inaccessible, even if there's ADA pads there. I think that kind of ongoing conversations about what in particular MnDOT and Metro Transit can do to increase communication and to the degree that we need to have formalized maintenance agreements, that would be good. To have a little more involvement from this committee and myself and folks with disabilities, I think would be really great. And I know that a couple of years ago, MnDOT had a public right-of-way and accessible bus stop working group. I'm not sure if that meets. I haven't been to any meetings or heard of them, but would be good to see if something like that could be revitalized, especially with the ADA transition plan being updated and with this work coming out, a good opportunity to maybe bring some of these considerations to fruition. Just a few other things related to the sidewalk maintenance too. The report says that MnDOT doesn't have a clearly articulated sidewalk maintenance policy. So if there's any ways that this committee, or again myself, we could work to partner on something like that or provide input on that, that would be a suggestion. Again, I'm kind of reiterating what I shared online in my comments, but wanted to make sure that I put them out here for the record. Last thing I suppose I will say here is that there was a comment about kind of holistically looking at walking and that term walking and being sensitive to that and what does that ultimately mean. And I understand that with the report, I think kind of later on in the report, it does mention that, we take walking to mean not just individuals on foot. Might be a suggestion to move that up towards the beginning and really state that for a pedestrian plan that historically has been about ambulatory individuals, that we look at, making that more of a front and center issue and something that, if cared deeply about it, is brought forward at the beginning. Certainly if you're looking for individuals to provide comment on such a large plan, a very long document, that be at the very beginning, or at least called out in the executive summary at the beginning. And then one last thing, Jake, and I appreciate you listening to this, same with you, Chair, and committee members. The ADA field walks, you mentioned this. I think this is another great opportunity for involvement from this committee and from myself. If there's a way that, maybe we have an individual or individuals from that ADA unit talk to the committee here, would be great to see if there could be greater collaboration with these ADA field walks going forward. So thank you again, Jake, for your time. I appreciate it. And thanks, Chair and committee members, for letting me talk.
Thanks. I appreciate the comments, and I've got lots of notes. So thank you, Guthrie.
This is David Fenley again. Thank you very much, Jake. We are pushing up against the end of our meeting. I want to give some time for the last few things on our agenda. That was a great discussion. Thank you, Guthrie, for adding that in as well. Ken Rogers is not in attendance today. He's in another meeting. So I will skip over the blue line report. Chris, do you have anything to say on the green line?
Not really. It's moving right along, and my friends in Eden Prairie are hating the construction.
Fantastic. We had a great update from them. I think it was not last month because we didn't meet last month, but in November. Daryl on Golden Rush. Gold Rush. You're muted.
Yeah, this is Daryl Paulson again, Vice Chair. I also have a COVID beard and wearing a cap today, no glasses. But the reason the gold line I would say is 60% done. We're in the process of meeting with small groups along the corridor to finalize some station design, and we also took into account Ken Rogers' comments and Sam's comments relating to, I think it was the corridor along I I can't pronounce it. I think it starts with a G. Jessamine or somewhere along there on the, I think it's towards the east side of the project. But I mean, so I will say that your comments that Ken brought forth and Sam's comments that she brought forth are being very, very detailed, looked at and scrutinized. And I know in our last meeting that we spoke earlier this month, that was one of our first pieces on our agenda, was that we connected with this group. We connected with particularly TAC to retrofit a couple of those station designs before we told our engineers to go ahead with it. So I want to thank you for your due diligence and the staff and the committee as a whole to keeping us accountable, keeping us on track, and making us go back and looking at different station platforms. If they don't fit the actual design, make us redo it, because we will. Thank you for keeping us accountable.
Thank you, Daryl. I will real quickly in the chair's report just let you know that the letter that we're working on for more accessible seating with buses is still moving along at a snail's pace. And any support from committee members, please let me know via email or phone call after this meeting, and would love to have some input on that. Is there members of the public who would like to comment? Seeing none, we have time for members, committee members from the TAC to comment now. Would anybody like to say anything?
This is Sam Jasmine. I just want to comment for the MnDOT, for the traffic or pedestrian safety on. I don't know who you'll get information from with the pedestrian audible signals, but that really is a part of making crosswalks safer, especially when they're busy.
Right.
Any other members have comment in the next minute or so?
This is Daryl Paulson again. I too want to thank the presenters today. I think they did a real thorough job in laying out what their ideal pedestrian right-of-way would look like in terms of transit and how that mirrors and how we work together. So I do want to thank Jake and Nazra particularly in their due diligence to work with this committee and to keep us apprised as to what they're doing. However, I do think that we need to really push back on the maintenance agreements with municipalities, and we need to look at lighting, and we need to look at some safety and security issues that we typically leave last minute.
I'll keep it open for one more member to comment. We are at 2:30 right now. All right. No other comments. We are adjourned. Try to be safe, people. Have a wonderful rest of your day.